In the shadowed corridors of Raven's Hollow Palace, where centuries of secrets echo through marble halls, King Edmund's hands trembled as he held the letter that would change everything. The parchment, aged and yellowed, bore the royal seal of his late father, a seal that had been broken 30 years too late. What it revealed about Queen Isabella's past would either save their crumbling marriage or destroy the monarchy forever. As thunder rolled across the kingdom and rain lashed against the palace windows, the king faced an impossible choice: expose the truth and watch his world burn, or bury the secret and lose the woman he loved more than his crown. But some truths, once awakened, refused to sleep again. And in the heart of the palace, where love and duty waged their eternal war, one man's desperate gesture would prove that even kings must sometimes choose between their throne and their soul. The grandfather clock in the royal study struck midnight as King Edmund sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his ancestors whose portraits lined the mahogany-paneled walls. The storm outside Raven's Hollow Palace had been raging for 3 days, but the tempest within his heart had been brewing for far longer. His marriage to Queen Isabella hung by the thinnest of threads, and, with each passing day, the distance between them grew wider than the moat that protected their ancient fortress. Edmund's weathered fingers traced the edges of the mysterious letter that had arrived that morning, delivered by a courier who disappeared into the mist as quickly as he had appeared. The envelope bore his father's personal seal, the same seal he had watched his father press into warm wax countless times during his childhood. But King Richard had been dead for 15 years. How could this letter exist? The king's hands shook as he broke the seal. His father's familiar handwriting sprawled across the cream-colored paper in urgent, slanted strokes. The words that greeted him made his blood run cold. My dearest Edmund, if you are reading this, then the time has come for you to learn the truth about Isabella's past. What I am about to tell you will shake the very foundations of our kingdom, but you must know. The woman you love carries a secret that could either redeem our family's greatest sin or destroy everything we have built. In the vault beneath the chapel, behind the tomb of Queen Marguerite, you will find the proof. Use it wisely, my son. The fate of the crown rests in your hands. Your loving father, Richard. Edmund's mind reeled as he read the letter again and again, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate hoax. But the paper, the ink, even the faint scent of his father's cologne that clung to the parchment, everything was authentic. His father had somehow arranged for this letter to reach him 15 years after his death, timed perfectly for this moment of crisis. The king rose from his desk and moved to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Lightning illuminated the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over the grounds for centuries, their twisted branches reaching toward the castle like gnarled fingers. In the distance, he could see the spire of the chapel where generations of royalty lay in eternal rest. Somewhere beneath those hallowed stones lay the answers to questions he had never thought to ask. Isabella's voice echoed in his memory from their argument the previous evening. You don't know me, Edmund, she had said, her emerald eyes blazing with a pain he couldn't understand. You think you married some perfect princess, but you have no idea who I really am or where I came from. At the time, he had dismissed her words as the emotional outburst of a woman struggling with the pressures of royal life. Now, he wondered if she had been trying to tell him something far more significant. Their marriage had begun as a political alliance, arranged by their fathers to unite two powerful kingdoms. But somewhere along the way, Edmund had fallen desperately in love with the mysterious woman who had arrived at his court with only a small retinue and few personal belongings. Isabella was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed a grace that made her a natural queen. Yet there had always been shadows in her past that she refused to discuss, questions about her childhood that she would deflect with a sad smile and a change of subject. The king's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his study. He quickly folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket as the door opened to reveal his most trusted advisor, Lord Chancellor Marcus Whitmore. The elderly man's silver hair was disheveled, and his usually impeccable attire showed signs of hasty dressing. Your Majesty, Marcus said with a respectful bow, forgive the intrusion at this late hour, but I bring urgent news from the capital. The Duke of Westmere has been making inquiries about Her Majesty's lineage. His agents have been asking questions in the villages near the Thornfield border, particularly about events that occurred 30 years ago. Edmund felt his heart skip a beat. The timing was too coincidental. What sort of questions? Questions about missing children, my lord. Specifically, about a girl who disappeared during the Thornfield Rebellion. The Duke seems to believe there may be some connection to the royal family. Marcus paused, studying the king's face carefully. Sire, is there something you haven't told me? Some reason the Duke would be investigating the Queen's past. The king turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him like a specter. The Duke of Westmere was his cousin and the most likely successor to the throne should Edmund die without an heir. The man had always harbored ambitions for the crown, and in recent months, his opposition to Edmund's policies had become increasingly vocal. If the Duke was investigating Isabella's background, it could only mean one thing. He was searching for ammunition to use against the monarchy. Marcus, Edmund said quietly, what do you know about the Thornfield Rebellion? The official accounts, I mean. The old man stroked his beard thoughtfully. It was before my time at court, but I remember the stories. Lord Thornfield attempted to overthrow King Richard, claiming the crown rightfully belonged to his family line. The rebellion was crushed, and Thornfield's castle was burned to the ground. Most of his family perished in the fire, though some say a few servants and children escaped into the forest. And what happened to those who escaped? No one knows for certain, sire. They vanished without a trace. Some believe they fled to neighboring kingdoms, others think they perished in the wilderness. Why do you ask? Edmund's mind was racing. If Isabella was somehow connected to the Thornfield family, it would explain so much. Her reluctance to discuss her past, the sadness that sometimes clouded her eyes when she thought no one was watching, and, most importantly, why she had arrived at court with so few possessions and no clear family connections. But it would also mean that the woman he loved was the descendant of traitors, enemies of his own bloodline. Marcus, I need you to do something for me, and I need your absolute discretion. Of course, Your Majesty. I want you to research everything you can find about the Thornfield family. Not the official records, those can be doctored. I want you to speak to people who were alive during the rebellion, servants who might have witnessed things that never made it into the history books. Can you do this without arousing suspicion? It will take some time, but yes. May I ask what has prompted this sudden interest in ancient history? Edmund pulled the letter from his pocket and showed it to his advisor. Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized the royal seal. My God, he whispered. How is this possible? I don't know. But whatever my father discovered, he thought it was important enough to arrange for this letter to reach me after his death. I need to understand what he was trying to tell me before it's too late. The two men stood in silence for several moments, the weight of the revelation settling between them like a heavy curtain. Finally, Marcus spoke. What about the Queen? Will you tell her about the letter? Edmund's heart ached as he considered the question. Isabella was sleeping in the royal chambers just down the hall, unaware that her world might be about to crumble around her. For 3 years, she had been his wife, his partner, his closest confidant. The thought of keeping such a momentous secret from her felt like a betrayal. But the thought of confronting her with accusations about her past felt even worse. Not yet, he said finally. I need to understand what we're dealing with first. If the Duke of Westmere is already investigating, then time is not on our side. We need answers before he finds them himself. Marcus nodded grimly. And what of the vault your father mentioned? Will you search for this proof he spoke of? Edmund's gaze returned to the chapel spire visible through the rain-soaked windows. Tomorrow night, when the servants are asleep and the guards are at their posts, we'll go together. Whatever my father hid in that vault, it's waited 15 years for me to find it. I can wait one more day. The Chancellor departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Edmund alone once again with his thoughts and fears. The letter felt like a burning coal in his pocket, its presence impossible to ignore. He thought about Isabella sleeping peacefully in their bed, her dark hair spread across the silk pillowcase, her breathing slow and steady. She looked so innocent in sleep, so vulnerable. It was difficult to imagine her connected to treachery and rebellion. But as the hours crawled toward dawn, Edmund couldn't shake the feeling that his father's letter had set something irreversible in motion. Like a stone cast into still water, the revelation would create ripples that would spread throughout the kingdom until nothing remained unchanged. The only question was whether those ripples would bring clarity or chaos. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds, King Edmund finally left his study and made his way through the quiet corridors toward his chambers. Each step felt weighted with the gravity of what lay ahead. In less than 24 hours, he would descend into the vault beneath the chapel and uncover whatever truth his father had hidden there. He would learn who Isabella really was, where she had come from, and why her past was significant enough to threaten the stability of the crown. But With each step closer to his sleeping wife, he wondered if some truths were too dangerous to uncover. Some secrets were buried for good reason, and some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. As he reached for the handle of their bedroom door, Edmund realized that whatever he discovered in that vault would change everything: his marriage, his kingdom, and possibly his life. The only question was whether he would have the strength to face the consequences of his father's final revelation. The following evening descended upon Raven's Hollow Palace like a shroud, thick with anticipation and dread. King Edmund spent the day in a state of barely controlled anxiety, going through the motions of his royal duties while his mind remained fixated on the secret that awaited him in the chapel vault. Every interaction with Queen Isabella felt strained and artificial, as though he were performing the role of a husband rather than being one. During the royal breakfast, Isabella had noticed his distraction. "Edmund, you seem troubled," she had said, her green eyes searching his face with genuine concern. "Is there something weighing on your mind?" The irony of her question had almost broken his composure. How could he tell her that he suspected her entire identity might be a carefully constructed lie? How could he explain that he was about to excavate secrets that might destroy their marriage and her claim to the throne? Instead, he had forced a smile and blamed his mood on affairs of state, watching as relief flickered across her beautiful features. Now, as the palace settled into the quiet rhythm of night, Edmund made his way through the darkened corridors toward the chapel. Lord Chancellor Marcus waited for him in the shadows of the main hallway, carrying a leather satchel containing tools and a lantern. The two men moved silently through the palace, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets, and their breathing careful and controlled. The chapel stood at the heart of Raven's Hollow Palace, its soaring Gothic arches and stained glass windows a testament to centuries of royal devotion. During the day, it was a place of peace and contemplation, where kings and queens had prayed for wisdom and guidance. Tonight, it felt ominous and forbidding, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering candlelight. "The tomb of Queen Marguerite is behind the altar," Marcus whispered as they made their way down the center aisle. "She was your great-great-grandmother, known for her charitable works and her mysterious death." Edmund nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Queen Marguerite had died under strange circumstances, reportedly falling from her horse while riding alone through the forest. Some historians suggested she had been murdered, though no proof had ever been found. Now he wondered if her death was somehow connected to whatever secret his father had hidden beneath her resting place. They reached the altar, an imposing marble structure adorned with golden candlesticks and religious artifacts. Behind it, set into the wall, was the elaborate tomb of Queen Marguerite. Her marble effigy lay serenely atop the sarcophagus, hands folded in prayer, stone eyes gazing toward heaven. The inscription below her image spoke of her virtue and devotion, but offered no hints about the secrets that might lie beneath. "How do we move it?" Edmund asked, running his hands along the edges of the tomb. Marcus examined the structure carefully, his experienced fingers probing for hidden mechanisms. "These old tombs often have secret passages," he murmured. The royal architects of that era were fond of hidden chambers and concealed doorways. He pressed against various decorative elements, searching for something that might trigger a release. After several tense minutes, Marcus discovered a small cross carved into the base of the tomb that moved when pressed. There was a soft clicking sound, followed by the grinding of ancient stone mechanisms. Slowly, incredibly, a section of the floor behind the tomb began to descend, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness below. "Remarkable," Edmund breathed. "How long has this been here?" "Since the chapel was built, I would imagine. These passages were designed as escape routes for the royal family in times of danger." Marcus lit the lantern and held it aloft, illuminating the first few steps of the descent. "Shall we proceed, Your Majesty?" The staircase was narrow and steep, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the palace. The walls were damp and covered with a thin film of moss, and the air carried the earthy scent of deep underground spaces. Their footsteps echoed in the confined space as they descended, the lantern casting dancing shadows that made the journey feel like a descent into the underworld itself. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small chamber carved from solid rock. The walls were lined with wooden shelves and stone alcoves, many containing ancient documents, jewelry, and artifacts that had been hidden away for centuries. But at the center of the chamber stood a single wooden chest, its surface carved with the royal coat of arms and secured with an ornate lock. "This must be what your father wanted you to find," Marcus said, approaching the chest carefully. Edmund produced a small key from his pocket, one that had belonged to his father and which he had worn on a chain around his neck since the old king's death. "I never knew what this was for," he said quietly. "Father gave it to me on his deathbed, but he was too weak to explain its purpose." The key fit perfectly into the ornate lock. With a soft click, the chest opened, revealing its carefully preserved contents. Inside were dozens of documents, letters, and what appeared to be official records dating back 30 years. At the top of the pile lay a single piece of parchment with his father's handwriting. "For my son, when the truth can no longer remain buried." Edmund lifted the documents with trembling hands and began to read by the light of Marcus's lantern. What he discovered in those pages shattered everything he thought he knew about his wife, his kingdom, and his own family's history. The first document was a birth certificate, yellowed with age but still legible. It recorded the birth of a daughter to Lord Thomas Thornfield and Lady Catherine Thornfield on the 15th day of March, 33 years ago. The child's name was listed as Isabella Rose Thornfield. "My God," Marcus whispered, reading over the king's shoulder. "The queen is Lord Thornfield's daughter. She's the rightful heir to the Thornfield estates." But that was only the beginning. As Edmund continued to read, he learned that Isabella had not simply escaped the burning of Thornfield Castle. She had been deliberately saved by King Richard himself. The documents revealed that Edmund's father had secretly loved Lady Catherine Thornfield before her marriage to Lord Thomas, and that he had never forgiven himself for letting political considerations force her into an unhappy union. When the rebellion began, King Richard had tried to prevent the bloodshed by offering Lord Thornfield terms for surrender. But Thomas Thornfield was too proud and too angry to accept mercy from the man he blamed for stealing his wife's affections. The siege of Thornfield Castle had lasted for 3 days, ending when the defenders set fire to their own stronghold rather than surrender. In the chaos of the final battle, King Richard had personally led a rescue mission to save Lady Catherine and her daughter. He arrived too late to save Catherine, who had perished in the flames, but he managed to rescue Isabella and several other children. Rather than reveal his actions to the court, which would have raised questions about his motives, he had arranged for Isabella to be secretly adopted by a loyal noble family in a distant province. "He saved her life," Edmund said in amazement. "My father saved Isabella's life, and then spent the next 30 years ensuring she was cared for and educated. That's why she arrived at court with so few possessions. She didn't know her true identity." But there was more. The final document in the chest was a letter addressed to Isabella herself, written in King Richard's careful hand. In it, he explained her true heritage and revealed that her adoption had been arranged not just out of compassion, but as part of a larger plan. King Richard had always intended for Isabella to marry his son when she came of age, believing that such a union would heal the wounds left by the Thornfield Rebellion and unite the kingdom under a banner of reconciliation rather than conquest. He planned this, Edmund realized. Our marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was my father's attempt to right a historical wrong. He wanted to restore the Thornfield bloodline to a position of honor. Marcus studied the documents carefully. But why keep it secret? Why not reveal her true identity when she arrived at court? Because revealing that she was a Thornfield would have made her a target, Edmund replied. The noble families who benefited from the redistribution of Thornfield lands would never have accepted her return. And the Duke of Westmere. Edmund's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. The Duke stands to inherit vast Thornfield territories if Isabella's claim is never recognized. That's why he's investigating her background. He suspects the truth. The chamber fell silent except for the soft dripping of water somewhere in the darkness beyond their lantern's glow. Edmund felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted, leaving him struggling to find his balance in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Everything he thought he knew about his marriage, his father's policies, even the rebellion that had shaped his childhood understanding of loyalty and betrayal, all of it had been turned upside down. What will you do with this information? Marcus asked gently. Edmund looked at the documents in his hands, each page representing a piece of his wife's stolen past. Isabella had spent her entire adult life believing she was the daughter of minor nobility, never knowing that royal blood flowed in her veins or that she had a legitimate claim to vast estates and ancient titles. She had married him believing herself to be politically insignificant, never realizing that their union was the fulfillment of a plan 30 years in the making. "I need to tell her the truth," Edmund said finally. "She has a right to know who she really is, where she came from, and why she lost her family. And if she chooses to claim her inheritance, the Thornfield estates are worth a fortune, and their return to her possession would shift the balance of power significantly. Then, that's her choice to make," Edmund replied firmly. "She's been denied her identity long enough. I won't be another person who keeps her in the dark about her own life." But even as he spoke these words, Edmund felt a chill of fear run down his spine. Revealing Isabella's true identity would indeed shift the balance of power in the kingdom, but it would also paint a target on her back. The Duke of Westmere was not the only noble who would see her claim as a threat to their own interests. There were others who had profited from the Thornfield family's destruction, and they would not welcome the return of Lord Thomas's daughter. Moreover, there was the question of how Isabella herself would react to learning that her entire life had been built on carefully constructed lies. Would she forgive King Richard for keeping her heritage secret? Would she understand that the man she had married was the son of the king who had ordered her father's death, even if he had also saved her life? Would their love survive the revelation that their marriage had been orchestrated by forces beyond their control? As they carefully replaced the documents in the chest and began their journey back to the surface, Edmund realized that uncovering his father's secret was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, finding the courage to share this truth with Isabella and helping her navigate the dangerous waters of noble politics that would inevitably follow. The chapel above seemed different when they emerged from the hidden chamber, as though the building itself had been transformed by the secrets it had harbored. Edmund felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him as he stood before Queen Marguerite's tomb, wondering how many other royal secrets lay buried beneath the palace floors. "When will you tell her?" Marcus asked as they made their way back through the darkened corridors. "Tomorrow," Edmund replied. "I've kept too many secrets from my wife already. It's time for truth, whatever the consequences may be." But as he reached the door to the royal chambers, Edmund paused with his hand on the handle. Inside, Isabella slept peacefully, unaware that her world was about to change forever. In the morning, she would wake to discover that she was not who she thought she was, that her husband's father had been both the destroyer and savior of her family, and that her very existence posed a threat to powerful men who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Edmund closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer to whatever gods watched over kings and queens. He prayed for wisdom to find the right words, for strength to face the storms ahead, and for love strong enough to survive the revelations that tomorrow would bring. Then, with a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped into the darkness of his chambers, carrying the weight of truth like a crown of thorns. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the royal breakfast chamber as Queen Isabella sat across from her husband, sensing the storm clouds gathering behind his usually warm brown eyes. She had awakened to find Edmund already dressed and standing by the window, his posture rigid with tension that had been building for days. Something was terribly wrong, and the careful distance he had maintained since yesterday morning felt like a chasm opening between them. "Edmund," she said softly, setting down her cup of tea with deliberate care. "I know you said affairs of state were troubling you, but this feels like something more personal. Have I done something to upset you?" The king's heart nearly shattered at the genuine worry in her voice. Isabella sat before him in her morning dress of pale blue silk, her dark hair loosely braided over one shoulder, looking every inch the elegant queen she had become. But more than that, she looked vulnerable and confused, unaware that the foundation of her entire existence was about to crumble beneath her feet. "My beloved," Edmund said, rising from his chair and moving to kneel beside hers, "you have done nothing wrong. Nothing at all. But I have something to tell you that will change everything between us, and I need you to prepare yourself for revelations that may be difficult to accept." Isabella's emerald eyes widened with alarm. Are you planning to set aside our marriage? Have you found grounds for annulment?" "No." Edmund grasped her hands tightly, feeling how cold her fingers had become. "Never that. I love you more than my crown, more than my life. But, Isabella, what I'm about to tell you concerns your past, your family, and the circumstances that brought you to my court. I need you to listen carefully and try to remain calm." He led her to the small sitting area near the fireplace, where they could speak privately without the servants overhearing. Isabella's face had grown pale, and Edmund could see her mind racing through possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. 3 nights ago, I received a letter," Edmund began, producing the mysterious correspondence from his jacket. A letter from my father, delivered 15 years after his death. Isabella stared at the royal seal, her breathing becoming shallow and quick. That's impossible. How can a dead man send letters? He arranged for its delivery before he died. Time to reach me when some crisis made the truth necessary. Edmund's voice was gentle but firm. Isabella, do you remember anything about your childhood before you went to live with Lord and Lady Pemberton? Anything about your birth family? You know I don't, she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble. I was told my parents died in a fire when I was very young, and the Pembertons were kind enough to raise me as their own. Why are you asking me this? Edmund took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would shatter her world. Because that's not the complete truth. Your parents did die in a fire, but it wasn't an accident. It was during a rebellion against my father's crown, and your birth name wasn't Isabella Pemberton. The queen went very still, her face draining of all color. What are you saying? Your name is Isabella Rose Thornfield. You are the daughter of Lord Thomas Thornfield and Lady Catherine Thornfield, and you are the rightful heir to one of the most powerful estates in the kingdom. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Isabella stared at her husband in shocked silence, her mind struggling to process information that contradicted everything she had believed about herself for 30 years. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Thornfield? But the Thornfields were traitors. They rebelled against the crown. They were destroyed for their crimes against the realm. Yes, Edmund said quietly. Your father led a rebellion against mine. But, Isabella, my father was in love with your mother before she married Lord Thomas. The rebellion began because your father blamed my father for forcing Lady Catherine into a political marriage when her heart belonged elsewhere. Isabella pulled her hands free from his grasp and stood abruptly, moving to the window as if seeking escape. This is impossible. You're telling me that I'm the daughter of rebels, that my father was a traitor to the crown I now wear. How can that be true? Because my father saved you from the flames that killed your parents, Edmund continued, following her, but keeping his distance. He led a rescue mission to Thornfield Castle, arriving too late to save your mother, but in time to save you and several other children. Rather than reveal what he had done, which would have raised questions about his motives, he arranged for you to be secretly adopted by the Pembertons. Isabella pressed her palms against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the gardens where she had walked so many times, believing herself to be a minor noble who had been blessed with an extraordinary marriage. So everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie? Not everything, Edmund said urgently. Your character, your intelligence, your kindness, those are real. The love between us is real. But, yes, your heritage is far more significant than either of us realized. She turned to face him, and Edmund was heartbroken to see tears streaming down her cheeks. Why are you telling me this now? Why reveal it at all? Because the Duke of Westmere has been investigating your background. He suspects the truth, and if he discovers it first, he'll use it as a weapon against both of us. The Thornfield estates are vast and valuable. If your identity remains hidden, they revert to the crown, and much of that wealth will eventually pass to the Duke as my heir presumptive. So this is about money? About land and titles? No. Edmund stepped closer, desperate to make her understand. This is about justice. This is about giving you back the identity that was stolen from you. Isabella, you have a right to know who you are, where you came from, and why your family died. You have a right to claim what belongs to you by blood and birth. Isabella sank into a chair by the fireplace, her composure finally cracking completely. But if I claim the Thornfield inheritance, what does that make me? The daughter of a rebel, profiting from my father's treason? And what does it make you? The man who married his enemy's child. It makes us both human beings trying to heal wounds that were open long before we were born, Edmund said, kneeling before her chair. Isabella, my father spent 30 years planning for this moment. He arranged our marriage not just as a political alliance, but as a way to restore the Thornfield name to honor. He wanted to right the wrongs of the past. By having the son of one king marry the daughter of another? Isabella's voice was bitter now, colored by a pain Edmund had never heard before. How convenient for everyone except the people who actually have to live with the consequences. That's not fair, Edmund said quietly. Our marriage may have been arranged, but our love is real. That hasn't changed. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she seemed unable to find. Hasn't it? How can you look at me the same way, knowing that my father tried to kill yours? How can you trust me, knowing that I carry the blood of traitors? Because you are not your father. Edmund's voice rose with passion. You are the woman who tends to sick children in the village, who gives her own food to hungry servants, who cries when reading letters from grieving families. You are the woman who loves me not because I'm a king, but in spite of it. Your bloodline doesn't define your character, Isabella. Your actions do. But even as he spoke these words, Edmund could see that Isabella's world had fundamentally shifted. The woman who had awakened that morning believing herself to be a fortunate commoner blessed with royal marriage had been replaced by someone struggling to understand her place in a complex web of historical grievances and political machinations. There's more, isn't there? She asked, reading something in his expression. You haven't told me everything yet. Edmund hesitated, knowing that what came next would be even more difficult for her to accept. The documents my father left behind include a letter addressed to you personally. In it, he explains that he never forgave himself for your mother's death or for the circumstances that led to your father's rebellion. He spent 30 years ensuring that you were educated and cared for, but he also spent those years preparing for the day when you would reclaim your rightful place. Show me the letter. Isabella, perhaps we should wait. Show me the letter, Edmund. I have a right to read what your father wanted to tell me. With reluctance, Edmund retrieved the documents from his private study and returned to find Isabella standing by the fireplace, her back straight, and her chin lifted with a determination he recognized. This was the woman who had adapted to royal life with grace and intelligence, who had faced every challenge of queenship with dignity and strength. Now she was preparing to face the greatest challenge of all, discovering who she truly was. She read her father-in-law's letter in silence, her expression growing more complex with each paragraph. When she finished, she folded the parchment carefully and set it aside. He loved my mother, she said simply. Yes, I believe he did. And he felt responsible for what happened to my family. Yes. But he also saw an opportunity to unite two bloodlines and strengthen the kingdom through our marriage. Edmund nodded, watching her carefully. Isabella, I want you to know that regardless of my father's plans, regardless of the politics involved, my feelings for you are genuine. I didn't marry you because you were a Thornfield. I didn't even know you were a Thornfield. I married you because you made me believe in love. Isabella was quiet for several long moments, staring into the flames that danced in the fireplace. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new note of steel that Edmund had never heard before. What exactly does claiming my Thornfield inheritance involve? What would change if I acknowledged my true identity? Legally, you would become the Countess of Thornfield in your own right, with all the lands, titles, and privileges that entails. The estate includes vast farmlands, several villages, mining rights, and considerable wealth that has been held in trust by the crown since your father's death. And politically? Edmund chose his words carefully. It would shift the balance of power significantly. Several noble families have been granted leases on Thornfield lands over the past 30 years. They would not welcome having to renegotiate those agreements with you as the rightful owner. And the Duke of Westmere would lose his claim to much of that inheritance, making me a target for anyone who prefers the current arrangement. Yes. Isabella nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. And if I choose not to claim my inheritance? If I remain Queen Isabella and pretend this conversation never happened, then you would be living a lie for the rest of your life. And the Duke will continue his investigation until he uncovers the truth on his own. When that happens, he'll reveal it in whatever way serves his interests best, not yours. The Queen stood and moved to her writing desk, pulling out a piece of parchment and a quill. Then, I need to make my choice before someone else makes it for me. What are you doing? I'm writing letters, Isabella said, her voice steady and determined. One to Lord Chancellor Marcus, requesting a formal meeting to discuss a legal matter of inheritance. One to my adoptive parents, the Pembertons, asking them to come to court immediately. And one to the Duke of Westmere, inviting him to dinner tomorrow evening. Edmund felt his heart race. Isabella, what are you planning? She looked up from her writing, and for the first time since he had revealed the truth, Edmund saw a spark of the woman he had fallen in love with, intelligent, brave, and absolutely unwilling to be anyone's pawn. I'm planning to reclaim my life, my lord husband. If I am Isabella Rose Thornfield, daughter of rebels, and rightful heir to ancient lands, then I will face that truth with courage. But I will do it on my terms, not as the victim of someone else's scheming. Edmund watched his wife transform before his eyes, seeing her embrace the strength that came from finally knowing who she truly was. The revelation had shaken her to her core, but it had not broken her. Instead, it seemed to be awakening something that had always been there, the noble spirit that had survived tragedy and thrived in adversity. "And us?" he asked quietly. "What happens to our marriage when the kingdom learns that the queen is a Thornfield?" Isabella rose from her desk and moved to stand before him, taking his hands in hers. "That depends on whether you can love a woman who chooses to honor her father's memory instead of hiding from it. Can you stand beside a queen who refuses to apologize for the blood that flows in her veins?" Edmund cupped her face in his hands, seeing in her eyes the woman he had married and the woman she was becoming. "I can love that woman with all my heart. The question is whether she can forgive me for being the son of the king who destroyed her family. Your father saved my life, Edmund. Whatever else he did, whatever mistakes he made, he gave me the chance to grow up and find love with his son. That has to count for something." They stood together in the morning light, holding each other as the weight of revealed truth settled around them. Neither knew what the days ahead would bring, but both understood that their love would be tested by forces more powerful than they had ever imagined. Isabella Rose Thornfield was about to step into the light, and the kingdom would never be the same. The great dining hall of Raven's Hollow Palace had witnessed countless historic moments throughout its centuries of service to the crown, but never had the very air seemed to crackle with such dangerous tension as it did on the evening Queen Isabella had chosen to reveal her true identity. The massive oak table, which could seat 30 nobles in comfort, seemed almost intimate with only 4 people gathered around its polished surface, yet the weight of their conversation would reshape the kingdom's future. Duke Marcus of Westmere sat across from the royal couple, his sharp blue eyes constantly shifting between them as he tried to decipher the purpose of this unexpected invitation. At 62, the Duke was a silver-haired predator who had spent decades maneuvering for political advantage, and his instincts told him that something momentous was about to occur. Beside him sat Lord Chancellor Marcus Whitmore, whose normally composed demeanor betrayed subtle signs of nervousness that only someone who knew him well would recognize. "Your Majesty," the Duke said, raising his wine glass in a toast. "Thank you for this unexpected pleasure. It's been far too long since we've had the opportunity for intimate conversation." Edmund felt his jaw tighten at the Duke's patronizing tone, but Isabella remained serene, her posture perfect, and her expression giving nothing away. She had spent the past 2 days preparing for this moment, meeting with Lord Chancellor Whitmore to understand the legal implications of her heritage, reading every document related to the Thornfield estate, and, most importantly, mentally preparing herself for the battle that was about to begin. "Uncle Marcus," Isabella said, using the familiar title that acknowledged his position as Edmund's cousin. "I'm afraid this evening's gathering serves a purpose beyond mere social pleasure. Edmund, and I have discovered information that requires your immediate attention, given your interest in historical genealogies." The Duke's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. His investigators had been asking questions about Isabella's background for weeks, but he hadn't expected her to acknowledge their activities so directly. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Your Majesty." "I think you understand perfectly," Edmund interjected, his voice carrying the authority of kingship. "Your agents have been making inquiries in the villages near the Thornfield border, asking questions about missing children and events from 30 years ago. We know you've been investigating my wife's heritage." Duke Marcus set down his glass and leaned back in his chair, abandoning all pretense of casual conversation. "And what if I have? The people have a right to know who sits beside their king. Transparency in royal bloodlines has always been a cornerstone of our monarchy." "Has it?" Isabella's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Then, you'll be pleased to learn that I intend to provide complete transparency about my origins. In fact, that's why you're here tonight." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Isabella reached beneath the table and produced a leather portfolio containing the documents Edmund's father had hidden in the chapel vault. She placed it on the table between them, her movements deliberate and controlled. "My birth name is Isabella Rose Thornfield. I am the daughter of Lord Thomas Thornfield and Lady Catherine Thornfield, and the rightful heir to the Thornfield estates." The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. Duke Marcus stared at the portfolio as if it contained a venomous serpent, his face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and barely contained rage. Lord Chancellor Whitmore, despite having helped prepare for this moment, still looked stunned by the boldness of Isabella's approach. "That's impossible," the Duke said finally. "The Thornfield children all perished in the fire. There were no survivors. There were several survivors, Edmund said, opening the portfolio and spreading the documents across the table. My father saved them, including the infant daughter of Lord and Lady Thornfield. She was raised by the Pemberton family under a false identity to protect her from those who might wish her harm. Duke Marcus leaned forward to examine the documents, his political mind already racing through the implications. Birth certificates, adoption records, letters from King Richard. The evidence was comprehensive and damning to his own interests. If Isabella's claim was legitimate, it would cost him a fortune in inherited lands and significantly reduce his political influence. Assuming these documents are authentic, the Duke said carefully, "What exactly does Her Majesty intend to do with this information?" "I intend to formally claim my inheritance," Isabella replied. "Tomorrow morning, I will submit a petition to the royal court requesting the restoration of all Thornfield titles, lands, and properties to their rightful owner. I will also request that any nobles currently holding leases on Thornfield lands appear before the court to renegotiate their agreements." The Duke's composure finally cracked. "You cannot be serious. Those lands have been distributed fairly among loyal families for 3 decades. The economic disruption alone would be catastrophic, not to mention the political instability of legitimizing a traitor's bloodline." "Careful, uncle," Edmund's voice carried a warning. "You're speaking about my wife." "I'm speaking about the daughter of a man who tried to murder your father." Duke Marcus shot back, his face flushing with anger. Lord Thomas Thornfield committed high treason against the crown. His estates were rightfully forfeit, and his bloodline was justly attainted. Even if this girl is his daughter, she has no legal claim to anything. "Actually, she does," Lord Chancellor Whitmore interjected, speaking for the first time since the documents had been revealed. "The legal principle of corruption of blood typically applies only to the direct participants in treason, not to their children who were too young to be complicit. Lady Isabella was an infant when the rebellion occurred. She cannot be held responsible for her father's crimes. Furthermore," Isabella added, her voice growing stronger, "these documents prove that my father's rebellion was provoked by King Richard's interference in his marriage. While treason is certainly not justified by personal grievances, the circumstances suggest that this was a crime of passion rather than calculated betrayal." Duke Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "This is madness. You're legitimizing rebellion, encouraging every disgruntled noble to think they can take up arms against the crown without consequences to their heirs. Or," Edmund said quietly, "we're demonstrating that the crown is capable of justice and mercy, even when it requires acknowledging past mistakes." The Duke began pacing the length of the dining hall, his mind working frantically to find an angle of attack. "And what of the current leaseholders? Lord Brennan has invested thousands of gold pieces improving the Thornfield farmlands. Sir William has built a new manor house on what were once the castle grounds. Lady Margaret has established orchards and vineyards that support hundreds of workers. You would destroy all of that to satisfy one woman's desire for recognition." "I would honor existing improvements and ensure that current workers maintain their employment," Isabella replied. "But, yes, I would require new lease agreements that acknowledge my ownership. The revenue from those lands rightfully belongs to the Thornfield estate, and conveniently provides you with independent wealth that makes you less dependent on royal favor," the Duke observed with venom in his voice. "Is that what worries you, uncle?" Edmund asked. "That my wife might have resources of her own? That she might not need to rely solely on my generosity?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Duke Marcus had always assumed that his position as Edmund's heir presumptive gave him leverage over royal decisions. The king had no brothers, no children yet, and the Duke had carefully positioned himself as the most logical successor should anything happen to Edmund. But if Isabella claimed the vast Thornfield inheritance, she would become one of the wealthiest nobles in the kingdom, with resources that could rival the crown itself. "I worry about the precedent," the Duke said, attempting to regain his composure. "If we allow attainted bloodlines to reclaim their inheritances based on sob stories about family tragedies, where does it end? Every rebel's descendant will crawl out of the woodwork demanding restitution." "This isn't about setting precedents," Isabella said firmly. "This is about correcting a specific injustice. My father rebelled against the crown, yes, but he did so because King Richard destroyed his marriage for political gain. The rebellion lasted 3 days, caused minimal damage to the kingdom, and ended with the voluntary destruction of Thornfield Castle rather than continued warfare." "Voluntary destruction?" Duke Marcus laughed bitterly. Your father burned down his own castle rather than surrender to lawful authority. That hardly speaks to minimal damage or reasonable behavior. He burned it down to avoid a siege that would have cost the lives of innocent servants and villagers, Isabella countered. Whatever his faults, Lord Thomas Thornfield chose to destroy his own property rather than see others die for his cause. Edmund watched the exchange with growing admiration for his wife's preparation and poise. She had anticipated every argument the Duke might raise, and prepared responses that turned his attacks into evidence of her own reasonableness. But he could also see the strain in her eyes, the cost of defending a father she barely remembered against accusations that carried painful truth. There's another consideration, Lord Chancellor Whitmore added diplomatically. The Duke's own investigation into Her Majesty's background has already generated rumors and speculation throughout the court. If we don't address this matter openly and decisively, others will continue to dig for information, and the resulting gossip could be far more damaging than controlled disclosure. This argument clearly struck home. Duke Marcus had indeed been indiscreet in his investigations, and word was already spreading among the nobles that something significant was being concealed about the Queen's origins. If the truth emerged through gossip and innuendo rather than official announcement, it would appear that the crown had been deliberately deceptive. So what exactly are you proposing? The Duke asked, returning to his seat. Complete transparency, Edmund replied. Tomorrow, Isabella will formally petition the court for recognition of her Thornfield heritage. We will acknowledge that the late King Richard arranged her adoption and our marriage as part of a plan to heal old wounds. We will present evidence of her legitimate claim to the Thornfield inheritance and invite any interested parties to contest those claims through proper legal channels. And if I choose to contest those claims, then you'll have your day in court, Isabella said. But, Uncle Marcus, I should warn you that my legal position is quite strong. And, more importantly, I have something you don't, which is the moral authority that comes from seeking justice rather than personal gain. The Duke's face darkened at the implication, but he couldn't deny the truth of her words. His interest in preventing Isabella's claim was entirely financial. He stood to lose a significant inheritance if she succeeded. Her interest, by contrast, could be presented as a quest to restore honor to her family name and correct historical injustices. This conversation is far from over, the Duke said, standing once again. I will consult with my own legal advisors, and we will see just how strong your claim really is. You're welcome to do so, Edmund replied. But, Marcus, I want to make something perfectly clear. Isabella is my wife and my queen, regardless of her bloodline. Any attack on her legitimacy is an attack on the crown itself. I hope you'll keep that in mind as you consider your response. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Duke Marcus understood that challenging Isabella's claim would require challenging Edmund's authority as king, and that was a battle he could not hope to win. His only option would be to undermine their position through political maneuvering and public opinion. After the Duke departed with stiff formality, Isabella slumped in her chair as the adrenaline of confrontation faded. That went better than I expected, she said wearily. He didn't actually draw a sword. He might as well have, Edmund replied. He'll fight this with everything he has, just using legal weapons instead of steel ones. Then, we'll have to be ready for a legal war, Isabella said, reaching for her husband's hand. Are you prepared for what comes next? The court battles, the gossip, the questioning of every decision we make. Edmund squeezed her fingers gently. Are you asking if I'm ready to fight beside the woman I love for the chance to right historical wrongs and build a better kingdom? Because the answer is yes. Even if it means acknowledging that your father made terrible mistakes? Even if it means admitting that our marriage was arranged not just for political convenience, but to assuage royal guilt? Especially then, Edmund replied firmly. Isabella, our love may have grown from seeds planted by others, but the tree belongs to us. Whatever brought us together, what we've built is real and valuable and worth defending. Lord Chancellor Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesties, if I may offer some practical advice. Tomorrow's court session will set the tone for everything that follows. We need to present Lady Isabella's case not as a challenge to royal authority, but as an example of royal justice. The narrative must be that King Edmund is courageously correcting his father's oversights, not that Queen Isabella is demanding reparations for past wrongs. Agreed, Isabella said. I am not seeking to overturn the past, but to honor it properly. I want to restore the Thornfield name not through rebellion, but through reconciliation. As the evening wound down and the servants began clearing the dinner service, Edmund felt a strange sense of anticipation rather than dread. For days, he had feared that revealing Isabella's heritage would destroy their marriage and destabilize the kingdom. Instead, he was discovering that truth, however complicated, was proving to be a stronger foundation than the well-intentioned lies of the past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, certainly. The Duke would marshal his forces, other nobles would choose sides, and the entire kingdom would watch to see how their king and queen handled this unprecedented situation. But tonight, Edmund looked at his wife and saw not just the woman he loved, but a true partner in the difficult work of ruling justly. Isabella Rose Thornfield was ready to claim her birthright, and Edmund was ready to stand beside her as she did it. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together, armed with truth and sustained by love that had proven stronger than the secrets that once threatened to destroy it. 6 months had passed since Queen Isabella Rose Thornfield. She now used her full name officially, had stood before the royal court, and reclaimed her birthright. The great hall of Ravenshollow Palace buzzed with activity as nobles, merchants, and common citizens gathered for what had become known as the Reconciliation Festival, an annual celebration that commemorated the peaceful resolution of the Thornfield inheritance dispute and honored the principle that justice delayed need not be justice denied. King Edmund stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the preparations in the courtyard below. Colorful banners bearing both the royal arms and the restored Thornfield coat of arms flew side by side in the autumn breeze, a visual symbol of the unity that had emerged from months of careful negotiation and genuine reconciliation. The sight filled him with a satisfaction he could never have imagined when this journey began. The legal battle had been fierce, but brief. Duke Marquis of Westmere had indeed contested Isabella's claim, assembling an impressive array of legal scholars and precedent citations. But the evidence of her identity was overwhelming, and, more importantly, public opinion had swung decisively in favor of the queen, who sought justice rather than revenge. When Isabella announced that she would honor all existing lease agreements and share the revenue from improved lands with those who had invested in them, even her opponents found it difficult to paint her as a threat to the established order. The turning point had come when Lord Brennan, the largest leaseholder of former Thornfield lands, publicly endorsed Isabella's claim and praised her fairness in negotiations. His support had triggered an avalanche of similar endorsements from other nobles who realized that Queen Isabella offered them partnership rather than punishment. Within 3 months, every major landholder had agreed to new terms that acknowledged Isabella's ownership while protecting their investments and ensuring continued prosperity for all involved. Duke Marquis had eventually withdrawn his legal challenge, though not his political opposition. He remained a vocal critic of what he called the dangerous precedent of rewarding ancestral rebellion, but his influence had waned significantly as other nobles distanced themselves from his increasingly bitter rhetoric. The king had been magnanimous in victory, offering the duke continued respect and position while making it clear that future cooperation would be welcomed but not required. A soft knock interrupted Edmund's thoughts. "Enter," he called, turning from the window as Isabella stepped into the study. She wore a gown of deep green silk embroidered with both roses and thistles, the flowers of reconciliation that had become her personal symbol, and her dark hair was crowned with a circlet that incorporated gems from both the royal treasury and the recovered Thornfield collection. "The delegation from Thornfield Village has arrived," she reported, her eyes bright with excitement. "They've brought the first harvest festival offerings from the restored estate, and, Edmund, you should see the pride on their faces. After 30 years of uncertainty about their future, they finally feel secure in their homes again." Edmund moved to embrace his wife, still marveling at the transformation these months had brought. The hesitant, sometimes melancholy woman who had questioned her place in the world had been replaced by a confident leader who wielded her reclaimed authority with wisdom and compassion. The Countess of Thornfield was every bit as formidable as the queen, but in ways that strengthened rather than threatened the monarchy. "And how are the preparations for tonight's memorial service?" he asked, knowing this evening would be emotionally challenging for Isabella. "Lady Catherine's memorial garden is beautiful," she replied softly. "The roses you had planted are blooming perfectly, and the stone carving of her likeness captures the kindness everyone remembered about her. I think your father would be pleased with what we've created in her honor." Tonight's festival would conclude with a memorial service for all those who had died during the Thornfield Rebellion, including both Isabella's parents and the royal soldiers who had perished in the conflict. It had been Isabella's idea to honor all the victims together, refusing to allow historical grievances to divide the dead into categories of heroes and villains. "There's something else," Isabella continued, her voice taking on a note of anticipation that Edmund recognized. "I received word from the Pemberton family this morning. They'll be arriving tomorrow with their youngest daughter, Sarah. Apparently, she's been studying the Thornfield family genealogy and has discovered something that might interest us. Oh, she believes there may be other survivors of the rebellion, other children who were saved and hidden away, possibly with false identities like mine. Sarah thinks she's found evidence of at least 2 other families that took in Thornfield refugees." Edmund felt his heart skip a beat. The possibility that Isabella might have living relatives, siblings, cousins, childhood companions who shared her heritage was both thrilling and potentially complicated. "How do you feel about that possibility?" "Hopeful," Isabella said without hesitation. "And terrified. What if there are others out there who have legitimate claims to parts of the Thornfield inheritance? What if they resent me for claiming everything while they've lived in obscurity? What if they don't want to be found? Then, we'll face those challenges as they come," Edmund replied, recognizing his own growth in the calm certainty of his words. 6 months ago, the discovery of additional claimants would have filled him with dread. Now he understood that truth, however complex, was always preferable to comfortable lies. If there are other Thornfield descendants, they deserve the chance to reclaim their heritage just as you did. Isabella smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "I love that you said, we'll face those challenges. 6 months ago, I felt so alone in the world, unsure of who I was or where I belonged. Now I know that whatever comes, we'll handle it together." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Chancellor Marcus Whitmore, who entered with his characteristic efficient bustle, carrying a leather portfolio that had become familiar over the months of legal proceedings. "Your Majesties," he said with a bow, "I bring the final documentation for the Thornfield Estate Trust. The legal framework is now complete, ensuring that any future claims can be evaluated fairly while protecting the interests of current stakeholders." The trust had been Isabella's masterpiece of political compromise. Rather than simply reclaiming her inheritance as personal property, she had established a legal structure that acknowledged the complexity of the situation. Current leaseholders became partners in the estate's prosperity, workers gained permanent protections and profit-sharing rights, and a portion of all revenue was dedicated to improving the lives of people throughout the former Thornfield territories. "The villagers' response has been overwhelming," Whitmore continued. "Agricultural production is up 30% from last year, and the new craft workshops are already turning a profit. Your approach has proven that historical justice need not come at the expense of current prosperity." Edmund nodded with satisfaction. The success of the Thornfield restoration had implications far beyond Isabella's personal situation. Other noble families with complicated histories were beginning to approach the crown about addressing old grievances, confident that King Edmund and Queen Isabella would seek solutions that honored the past while protecting the present. "Speaking of future claimants," the Chancellor continued, "I've been researching the records Sarah Pemberton requested. There are indeed indications that other children were rescued from Thornfield Castle. The evidence is fragmentary, but compelling enough to warrant investigation." "What sort of evidence?" Isabella asked. "Church baptismal records showing children with Thornfield names being registered in distant villages with different surnames shortly after the rebellion. Adoption documents that reference war orphans from the northern territories. Letters from monks who refer to caring for displaced nobles during the crisis period." Edmund and Isabella exchanged glances, both understanding the magnitude of what Whitmore was describing. If multiple children had been saved and hidden, it meant that the Thornfield bloodline was more extensive than anyone had realized. It also meant that Isabella's restoration might be only the beginning of a much larger process of historical reconciliation. "How many children are we potentially talking about?" Edmund asked. "At least 3, possibly as many as 6. The records suggest they ranged in age from infants to adolescents, with most being placed in different regions to reduce the chance of discovery." Isabella sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "So somewhere out there, I might have brothers and sisters who have been living their entire lives not knowing who they really are, just as I did." "It's possible," Whitmore acknowledged gently. "But, Your Majesty, You should prepare yourself for the possibility that not all of them survive to adulthood, or that some may prefer to remain in obscurity even if they learn the truth about their heritage. I understand, Isabella said quietly. But, Marcus, I need to know. I need to find them, if they're still alive, and give them the same choice I was given. They have a right to know who they are. Edmund moved to stand behind his wife's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders in a gesture of support that had become natural over the past months. Then, we'll find them, he said simply. We'll use every resource at our disposal to locate these potential relatives and offer them the truth about their heritage. And if they choose to claim their shares of the Thornfield inheritance? Whitmore asked. Then, they'll be welcomed as family, Isabella replied firmly. The Thornfield estate is large enough to support multiple heirs, and I would rather share wealth with relatives than hoard it alone. Edmund felt a surge of love and pride at his wife's words. The woman who had once feared that claiming her inheritance would make her a target for political enemies was now prepared to potentially divide that inheritance with strangers who might be family. She had grown from someone who questioned her own worth into someone who understood that true nobility came from lifting others up rather than standing alone. As the afternoon progressed, and the festival celebrations intensified in the courtyard below, the royal couple made their way through the palace to greet the various delegations that had come to honor the anniversary of Isabella's restoration. There were farmers from the Thornfield estates bearing gifts of grain and fruit, craftsmen displaying goods made in the new workshops, and nobles from throughout the kingdom who had come to celebrate an event that had proven it was possible to correct historical injustices without destroying current prosperity. The most moving moment came when an elderly woman approached Isabella with tears in her eyes. Your Majesty, she said, curtsying with difficulty, I was a kitchen maid at Thornfield Castle when you were born. I helped your nurse care for you during those first months, and I was there the night King Richard's soldiers rescued you from the fire. Isabella's composure nearly broke as she grasped the old woman's hands. You knew my parents? You knew me as a baby. Aye, my lady. You were the most beautiful child, with your mother's eyes and your father's stubborn chin. Lady Catherine sang to you every night, and Lord Thomas would pace the nursery for hours when you were fussy, refusing to let anyone else comfort you. For the first time since learning her true identity, Isabella heard personal details about her parents that went beyond the political circumstances of their deaths. She learned that her mother had loved poetry and often composed verses while nursing her infant daughter. She learned that her father had been building a toy castle for Isabella's first birthday when the rebellion began. She learned that both parents had spoken constantly of their hopes for their daughter's future, never imagining that future would be shaped by the very king they were fighting against. As evening approached and the memorial service began, Isabella stood before the assembled crowd with renewed understanding of who she was honoring. These were not historical figures or political symbols, but people who had loved and been loved, who had made terrible mistakes, but also terrible sacrifices, who had died hoping their daughter would somehow survive to have a better life. The memorial garden glowed with hundreds of candles as Isabella spoke about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the courage required to face difficult truths. She honored her father's love for his family while acknowledging his errors in judgment. She praised her adoptive parents for their kindness while recognizing the painful necessity of their deception. Most importantly, she thanked King Richard for saving her life while committing to use the opportunities he had given her to heal rather than perpetuate old wounds. When the service concluded and the last candle had been extinguished, Edmund and Isabella walked together through the quiet palace corridors toward their chambers. The day had been emotionally exhausting but deeply fulfilling, marking not just the anniversary of Isabella's restoration, but the continuing evolution of their understanding of justice, love, and responsibility. Whatever we discover about potential relatives, Isabella said as they paused outside their bedroom door, whatever new complications arise, I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything that brought us to this moment. The lies, the secrets, the revelations, all of it led to us finding each other and learning to build something honest and beautiful together. Edmund cupped her face in his hands, seeing in her eyes the woman who had grown from questioning her own worth to understanding her true value. Isabella Rose Thornfield, he said softly, you have been the greatest gift of my life, whatever name you carry. Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about hiding from the truth, but about facing it together. As they embraced in the moonlight streaming through the palace windows, both understood that their story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, potential new family members, and continued growth in their understanding of how to wield power responsibly. But tonight, they were simply a husband and wife who had learned that the strongest foundations are built not on comfortable lies, but on difficult truths courageously shared. The kingdom of Raven's Hollow slept peacefully around them, secure in the knowledge that their rulers faced the future with wisdom earned through adversity and love proven stronger than the secrets that once threatened to destroy it. And in the memorial garden, newly planted roses bloomed in honor of the dead, while promising hope for the generations yet to come.